The moment my parents sat down at Riverside Cafe and announced they were moving into my Lakehouse, my sister Vanessa was already scrolling through Pinterest boards for bedroom makeovers. My mother had brought paint swatches. My father had a list of furniture they'd need me to clear out to make room for theirs. They ordered lunch like we were celebrating. I sat there watching my coffee go cold, realizing they hadn't asked me a single question. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. They'd simply informed me that 742 Lakeshore Drive, the property I'd saved 7 years to buy, was about to become their retirement dream home. And when I said no, when that single word left my mouth and hung in the air between us, my mother's face transformed into something I'd seen 1,000 times before. Disappointment. Hurt. The specific brand of martyrdom she'd perfected over 3 decades of raising 2 daughters who somehow always owed her more than they could give. My name is Maya Chen, and I'm about to tell you how I learned that the cruelest thing you can do to entitled people is enforce a boundary. But I'm also going to tell you about the weapon I didn't know I had, the one my best friend Tyler had been building for 2 years while I thought I was just venting over drinks about my impossible family. Tonight, everything my parents assumed about me, about what they deserved, about which daughter mattered more, was going to shatter in a lawyer's office where every conversation I'd recorded, every text message I'd saved, and every dollar I could prove they'd stolen from my future was about to become evidence. The first time I realized my parents saw me differently than Vanessa, I was 12 years old. We were at my grandmother's birthday dinner, and someone asked what we wanted to be when we grew up. Vanessa, 16 and glowing with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no, announced she wanted to be a fashion designer. The table erupted in encouragement. My mother squeezed her hand. My father beamed with pride. When I said I wanted to be a software engineer, the enthusiasm dimmed like someone had turned down a dial. My father cleared his throat and suggested maybe I should think about something more social, something that would help me meet people. My mother worried that computers might be too isolating for a girl. What they meant, though I wouldn't understand it for years, was that Vanessa's dreams were worth celebrating and mine were concerning because they suggested I might actually succeed without needing them. The pattern continued through high school. Vanessa got a new car for her 17th birthday. I got a card with $200 and a reminder that responsibility builds character. When Vanessa barely graduated and announced she was taking a gap year to find herself in Europe, my parents funded 6 months of backpacking through 9 countries. When I graduated valedictorian with a full scholarship to the University of Minnesota, they told me they were proud but couldn't help with living expenses because they'd just committed to Vanessa's trip. I worked 3 part-time jobs during college. Vanessa posted Instagram photos from Barcelona, Paris, and Prague, each one liked and commented on by our mother with heart emojis and proud declarations about her adventurous daughter. The disparity became impossible to ignore during our respective weddings. Vanessa married Craig Brennan in an elaborate ceremony at a vineyard estate. Ice sculptures, a 12-piece band, salmon flown in from Alaska, and a dress that cost more than my entire college wardrobe. The final bill hit $35,000, and my parents paid every cent without hesitation. 2 years later, when I married Daniel, a kind architect I'd met through work, my parents handed me a check for $2,000 and explained they were still recovering financially from Vanessa's big day. We got married at a botanical garden with 40 guests and a playlist on borrowed speakers. It was beautiful. It was also the day I stopped expecting equal treatment and started accepting that in my parents' eyes, I would always be the daughter who didn't need them because I'd learned not to ask. Daniel and I divorced after 4 years. Not because we didn't love each other, but because his architecture firm transferred him to Seattle and my career was finally gaining momentum in Minneapolis. We parted as friends, both of us recognizing that sometimes timing matters more than affection. My parents expressed their sympathy in that particular way that felt more like validation than comfort, as if they'd been waiting for me to fail at something. Vanessa's marriage to Craig, meanwhile, was celebrated as enduring and strong right up until the day she called me sobbing to say he'd filed for divorce after discovering she'd opened 3 credit cards in his name and maxed them out funding another business venture that existed only in her imagination. The Lakehouse came into my life during a particularly dark winter. I was 31, recently divorced, working 60-hour weeks at a tech startup that would eventually go public and make me financially comfortable. I'd spent years saving aggressively, investing carefully, living below my means while watching Vanessa cycle through jobs and schemes with our parents' constant financial backing. When I saw the listing for 742 Lakeshore Drive, something shifted in my chest. The property had been a foreclosure, a family's dream abandoned during financial hardship. It needed work. The deck was rotting. The kitchen appliances were 15 years old. The master bathroom had wallpaper from another decade. But the bones were solid, the location was prime, and the view of Clearwater Lake from those floor-to-ceiling windows made me feel something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Possibility. Home. I made an offer that same week. $515,000, which would take nearly every dollar I'd saved plus a mortgage that would stretch my budget thin for the first few years. My financial advisor, Patricia Williams, walked me through the numbers 3 times to make sure I understood what I was committing to. She'd known me for 6 years by then, had watched me build wealth through discipline while my parents called asking if I could loan Vanessa money for yet another crisis. Pat was the first person who'd ever told me directly that my family was financially abusive, that the pattern of expecting me to fund Vanessa's disasters while receiving nothing in return wasn't normal sibling dynamics. It was exploitation dressed up as family obligation. I didn't tell my parents about the Lakehouse until after closing. I'd learned that lesson years earlier when I'd mentioned considering buying a condo, and my mother had immediately suggested I should get something big enough for Vanessa to stay in when she was between apartments, which was always. When I finally showed them photos, my father's first question was whether I'd gotten a good deal. My mother wanted to know if I'd considered how far it was from the city and whether I'd have time to maintain it properly. Vanessa scrolled through the pictures with a tight smile and said it was nice, then changed the subject to her latest business idea, a wellness retreat concept that would require startup capital she didn't have. The 18 months I owned the property before my parents announced their moving plans were the happiest of my adult life. I spent weekends stripping wallpaper and painting walls in colors I chose. I replaced the deck myself with Tyler's help, learning as we went, making mistakes and fixing them. I furnished the space gradually, choosing each piece deliberately, creating something that was entirely mine. I'd bring my laptop and work from the screened-in porch while eagles circled over the water. I'd kayak at sunrise before video calls with colleagues on the West Coast. I started inviting friends up for weekends, hosting small gatherings where people could relax without judgment or drama. Tyler called it my fortress of solitude. Pat called it the smartest investment I'd ever made, both financially and emotionally. Then Vanessa's most recent business collapsed. She'd sunk $40,000 of my parents' money into an online coaching program teaching people to build passive income, despite having never built passive income herself. When the venture produced nothing but debt and shame, she moved back into my parents' house in Bloomington. She was 35 years old, unemployed, divorced, and living in her childhood bedroom. My parents, now approaching retirement with less saved than they'd planned, suddenly found themselves supporting an adult daughter with expensive tastes and no prospects. Their house, a 4-bedroom suburban property they'd owned for 30 years, had become cramped and tense. My father's health was declining. My mother's patience was wearing thin. And apparently, they'd all agreed on a solution. They would move into my Lakehouse. All 3 of them. Without asking. Without offering rent. Without acknowledging that the property belonged to me alone. The conversation at Riverside Cafe started with small talk about the weather and my mother's new book club. We ordered sandwiches. My father complained about the traffic getting into the city. Vanessa checked her phone every 30 seconds, that nervous energy she always had when she was about to ask for something. Then my mother set down her water glass with deliberate precision and said they had exciting news. They'd decided to simplify their lives. The Bloomington house was too much work, too many stairs for my father's knees, too much yard maintenance. They'd been thinking about their next chapter, about what would make them happy in these golden years. My father jumped in with enthusiasm I hadn't heard from him in months. They'd realized the perfect solution had been right in front of them all along. The Lakehouse was sitting empty most of the week while I was in the city working. It made no sense for all that beautiful space to go unused. They could help maintain it, keep an eye on things, make sure the property was cared for properly. My mother added that Vanessa needed a fresh start somewhere peaceful, away from the painful memories of her failed marriage and business ventures. The lake air would be healing. They could all be together, supporting each other. Vanessa finally looked up from her phone and smiled at me with that expectant expression I knew too well. She'd already picked out which bedroom she wanted, the one with the best light for her morning yoga practice. She'd been researching the local community, thinking she might start a small consulting business helping other entrepreneurs avoid the mistakes she'd made. The lake towns were full of small business owners who could use her expertise. My mother had brought actual paint swatches, fanning them across the table between our plates. She thought the master bedroom could use freshening up, maybe a nice sage green or soft blue. Something calming for my father since he'd been having trouble sleeping. I watched this performance with a strange detachment, like I was observing actors in a play I hadn't auditioned for. They'd planned this down to the staging. The public setting where making a scene would reflect poorly on me. The excitement in their voices that would make my objection seem cruel. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The way they'd framed it as helping me by maintaining the property, as if I'd been struggling with the responsibility. My father pulled out a printed spreadsheet showing how they'd split utilities. My mother mentioned they'd already told Aunt Susan and Uncle Jim about the move. Vanessa had updated her Facebook relationship status to include her new city. That's when I said it. Just the word no, quiet and clear. The table went silent. My father's smile froze. My mother's hand stopped mid-reach for a paint swatch. Vanessa's face went blank with incomprehension, as if I'd suddenly started speaking another language. My mother recovered first, that familiar wounded expression settling over her features like a mask she'd worn so often it fit perfectly. She said she must have misunderstood. Of course I wanted my family close by. Of course I'd want to help them during this transition. My father's voice took on an edge. They weren't asking for charity. They'd contribute. They'd make improvements. I was acting like they were strangers instead of the people who'd raised me. Vanessa leaned forward, her voice dropping to that conspiratorial tone she used when positioning herself as the reasonable one. Maya, come on. You're there alone every weekend anyway. Wouldn't it be nice to have company? We could have family dinners on the deck. Mom could finally teach me to cook properly. Dad could fish off the dock. You're always saying you want us to spend more time together. I felt the familiar guilt rising, the conditioning of 3 decades telling me that refusing them made me selfish. That good daughters sacrificed. That family meant putting their needs above your own comfort. But underneath the guilt was something harder and clearer. Anger. The kind that had been building for years while I convinced myself I was overreacting. I set down my fork and looked at each of them in turn. Nobody asked me. You decided. You made plans. You told extended family. You picked out bedrooms and paint colors and created spreadsheets for my property. You did all of this without once considering that I might say no because you've never believed I had the right to say no. My mother's eyes filled with tears. After everything we've done for you. All the sacrifices we made raising you. This is how you repay us. By refusing to share what you have when your family needs help. My father pushed back from the table, his jaw tight. We supported you through college. We gave you a foundation to build this life. Now when we need something small in return, you're going to be selfish about it. The accusations came faster then. Vanessa said I'd always been cold, always cared more about money than people. My mother wondered aloud where she'd gone wrong raising a daughter who could turn her back on family. My father mentioned the $2,000 they'd given me for my wedding as if it was equivalent to the $35,000 they'd spent on Vanessa's. They were performing grief and shock for the other diners, making sure anyone watching would see them as the wounded parents and me as the ungrateful child. I stood up slowly, placed cash on the table for my untouched lunch, and said 4 words that would change everything. Talk to my lawyer. Tyler Martinez had been documenting everything for 2 years without me realizing it was evidence. I thought we were just friends venting over bourbon about our dysfunctional families. He'd listened to my stories about Vanessa's latest disaster and my parents' expectation that I'd fix it financially. He'd nod sympathetically when I explained how guilty I felt for having boundaries. What I didn't know was that Tyler, with his prosecutor's instinct and his meticulous nature, had been taking notes. Not because he was planning for this specific confrontation, but because he recognized a pattern that worried him as both my friend and an attorney who'd seen financial abuse destroy people. The morning after the Riverside Cafe disaster, I sat in his downtown office while he pulled out a file folder that had my name on it. Inside were printed emails, text message screenshots, bank transaction records, and a timeline that stretched back 5 years. "Maya," he said gently, "I need to show you something. You're not going to like it, but you need to see what I've been seeing." The first document was a spreadsheet tracking every time my parents had asked me for money. Not loans, Tyler clarified. Requests. Expectations. Emergencies that somehow always involved Vanessa. $4,000 for her boutique's opening costs. $2,500 when her car broke down. $1,800 for her share of my parents' property taxes when she was living with them. $6,000 for her divorce attorney retainer. The total over 5 years was $63,000. Money I'd given freely because that's what family did. Money I'd never expected back because asking would have made me selfish. "But here's what you didn't know," Tyler continued, pulling out bank records he'd subpoenaed as part of an unrelated case involving my parents' financial advisor George Hartley. "Your parents refinanced their house 18 months ago. Took out a $120,000 home equity line of credit. Guess where most of it went?" He showed me the transfer records. $85,000 had gone directly to accounts in Vanessa's name. Various business ventures. Debt consolidation. What they called investments in her future. My parents, who'd told me they couldn't help with my wedding because money was tight, had secretly given my sister nearly 6 times what I'd received. They'd mortgaged their paid-off house to fund her failures while telling me I was the successful one who didn't need help. Tyler wasn't finished. He'd obtained recordings from George Hartley, who'd grown increasingly uncomfortable with the financial advice my parents kept ignoring. In one recording, George explicitly warned my father that continuing to fund Vanessa's ventures was jeopardizing their retirement. My father's response was clear. "Maya will always be fine. She doesn't need us. Vanessa does. We have to help the child who needs us most." George had pushed back, pointing out that enabling wasn't helping. My mother's voice came through on the recording, sharp and defensive. "Maya has always been independent to the point of coldness. She made it clear she didn't need family. Vanessa needs us. That's not a weakness, that's love." The evidence kept mounting. Tyler had statements from Craig, Vanessa's ex-husband, detailing financial fraud during their marriage. Credit cards opened in his name. Joint accounts drained to fund business ideas he'd explicitly refused to support. A loan she'd taken against their house without his knowledge. Craig had settled the divorce quickly just to escape, but he'd kept documentation. He was willing to testify if needed. Patricia Williams, my financial advisor, had provided her own records. Times she'd advised me against lending money to family members. Conversations where I'd expressed guilt for having boundaries. Her professional opinion, submitted in writing, that my family's pattern of financial requests constituted exploitation of someone they knew had difficulty refusing them due to childhood conditioning. Then Tyler showed me something I hadn't known existed. Mrs. Eleanor Russo, my elderly neighbor at the lake, had installed security cameras after a break-in 2 years ago. Her property line touched mine. Her cameras captured my driveway and part of my deck. She'd mentioned it casually one weekend, saying she felt safer knowing someone was watching. What I hadn't realized was that she'd captured footage of my parents visiting the Lakehouse. Not the occasional afternoon stop I knew about, but multiple visits when I was at work in the city. Tyler had the timestamps. My parents had keys I'd given them for emergencies. They'd been entering my property regularly for 4 months, walking through rooms, measuring spaces, taking photos. In one clip, my mother was on the phone describing the master bedroom to someone, discussing furniture placement. Vanessa appeared in several recordings. She'd been staying at the Lakehouse overnight without my knowledge or permission, using it like a personal retreat center. Tyler had footage of her leading friends through on an unofficial tour, showing off the property like it was already hers. In one particularly damning clip, she told a friend that her parents were moving in soon and she'd finally have a decent place to launch her next business. The friend asked if I knew. Vanessa laughed and said I'd come around eventually. I always did. That I was too guilty about being successful to actually enforce boundaries. That our parents knew exactly how to make me feel obligated. Derek Simmons, the investigator Tyler had hired after I'd mentioned my parents' latest emergency loan request, had compiled financial records showing a pattern. Every time I achieved something professionally, within weeks there would be a family crisis requiring money. When I got promoted to senior engineer, Vanessa's boutique needed immediate inventory funding or it would close. When my stock options vested, my father had unexpected medical bills not covered by insurance. When I sold some investments to buy the Lakehouse, my mother's car needed replacing urgently. The timing was too consistent to be coincidental. Derek's professional opinion was that my family had been monitoring my financial success and timing their requests strategically. Tyler organized everything into a presentation he called the Boundary Enforcement Package. We're not going to court, he explained. We're going to give them a choice. Accept that the Lakehouse is yours alone and respect your decision, or face the public disclosure of how they've financially manipulated you for years. He'd prepared documents showing the disparate treatment between me and Vanessa. The wedding expenditures. The business funding. The bailouts and loans and emergencies that only ever flowed in one direction. Most importantly, he had proof of their unauthorized access to my property and their plans to occupy it without a lease or my consent, which constituted trespassing and potentially adverse possession attempts if left unchallenged. The meeting happened in Tyler's conference room on a gray November afternoon. My parents arrived with Vanessa and their own attorney, a family law specialist named Kenneth Rice who looked uncomfortable the moment Tyler began laying out documents. We started with the property deed, clear and unambiguous with only my name on it. Tyler presented the timeline of unauthorized entries, complete with video footage that Kenneth watched with increasing alarm. Then came the financial analysis. Every dollar I'd contributed to family emergencies displayed next to the money my parents had given Vanessa. The disparity was staggering when visualized. $63,000 from me. Over $200,000 to her when the home equity loan was included. My mother tried to interrupt, but Tyler raised a hand. We're not here to debate family dynamics. We're here to establish legal boundaries. Your clients entered Ms. Chen's property without permission on 47 occasions over 4 months. They measured rooms, photographed spaces, and discussed occupancy plans without the owner's consent. In Minnesota, this constitutes criminal trespass. Additionally, they announced publicly to extended family that they were moving into property they don't own, which could be construed as an attempt to establish false claims of residency rights. Kenneth Rice cleared his throat and asked for a moment to consult with his clients privately. When they returned, my father's face was rigid with barely controlled anger. My mother looked smaller somehow, her usual confidence deflated. Vanessa was crying, but I noticed she was watching me through her tears, gauging my reaction. Kenneth spoke carefully. My clients acknowledged that perhaps the communication about their housing plans could have been handled better. They're prepared to apologize for any misunderstanding and would like to discuss a reasonable rental arrangement for the Lakehouse that would benefit everyone. Tyler didn't hesitate. There is no rental arrangement. Ms. Chen's property is not available for occupancy by any family members at any price. The boundary is absolute. What we're offering is this. Your clients will publicly acknowledge that they made an error in assuming access to property they don't own. They will return all keys and access codes immediately. They will cease all discussion of moving to or visiting the Lakehouse. In exchange, the documentation we've compiled remains private. Nobody needs to know about the financial patterns, the unauthorized entries, or the substantial disparity in how the 2 daughters have been treated. My mother found her voice then, and it carried that familiar wounded quality. You'd actually humiliate your own parents over this. Air our private business to strangers. We gave you life, Maya. We raised you. And this is how you repay that love. By threatening us with lawyers. Tyler slid another document across the table. This is a transcript of a conversation between Mrs. Chen and her sister Susan. Recorded 3 weeks ago during a visit to the Bloomington house. Mrs. Russo's security system has audio capabilities. Would you like me to read the relevant portion? My mother's face went pale, but she nodded. Tyler read in a flat, professional tone. Linda Chen stated, Maya has always been difficult about sharing what she has. Even as a child, she was possessive. We've tried to teach her that family means sacrifice, but she's too focused on her career and her things to understand real love. The Lakehouse is wasted on her. She's there alone every weekend, working on her laptop instead of building relationships. If we're living there, at least it serves a purpose. At least it brings the family together the way it should be. Susan apparently asked if I'd agreed to this arrangement. Linda Chen responded that my agreement wasn't really necessary, that once they moved and I'd adapt like I always did, that I'd been trained my whole life to put family needs first even if I didn't realize that's what we'd been doing. The silence that followed was complete. Vanessa had stopped crying. My father stared at the table. My mother looked at Tyler like he'd committed an unforgivable betrayal by simply playing back her own words. Kenneth Rice closed his folder and addressed his clients directly. I strongly advise you to accept these terms. If this case proceeds to any kind of legal action, these recordings and financial analyses will become part of the public record. Your daughter has been extraordinarily generous in offering to keep this private. My father finally spoke, his voice hoarse. We were just trying to solve a problem. Our house is too much. Vanessa needs help. You have space. It seemed logical. Tyler responded with cold precision. Logical would have been asking. Respectful would have been accepting no as a complete answer. What you did was assume ownership of something you have no claim to, then attempt to manipulate Ms. Chen through guilt when she asserted her rights. That's not family. That's exploitation. We gave them 72 hours to decide. Accept the boundaries and keep their dignity, or fight and have everything exposed. Tyler had prepared additional documents showing that if they attempted any kind of legal challenge to my property ownership, he'd countersue for the $63,000 I'd given them over 5 years, which he'd carefully classified as loans and legal paperwork they'd signed without reading. He'd also file formal trespassing charges and provide all evidence to their homeowner's insurance company, which could impact their coverage. The acceptance came in 48 hours. Kenneth Rice delivered it personally, looking relieved to be done with clients who'd lied to him about their daughter's consent. They returned keys in a padded envelope with no note. My mother sent a single text message. We thought you'd want to help your family. I guess we were wrong about who you are. I didn't respond. Vanessa sent a longer message about how I'd broken our mother's heart, how I'd chosen property over people, how she'd always known I was cold but never realized I was cruel. I blocked her number. George Hartley reached out privately to say my parents had finally agreed to meet with him about realistic retirement planning now that the Lakehouse scheme had failed. He mentioned they'd have to sell the Bloomington house to cover the home equity debt Vanessa's ventures had created. They were looking at a modest condo, something manageable on their actual retirement income without the fantasy bailout from me. Patricia Williams called it the natural consequences of decades of poor financial decisions finally arriving. I drove to Clearwater Lake that weekend and changed every lock. I had the security system upgraded and added cameras of my own. Mrs. Russo brought over cookies and said she'd been hoping I'd finally stand up to them. She'd watched my parents walk through my house like they owned it and wanted to say something but hadn't known if it was her place. Now she knew to call me immediately if anyone approached the property. I sat on the deck with coffee and watched the November sun set over water that belonged to me alone. My phone stayed silent. No emergency texts. No guilt trips. No last-minute crises requiring my immediate financial intervention. Tyler had explained that the recording of my mother would ensure long-term compliance. She knew that her own words, stating explicitly that they'd trained me to prioritize family needs without realizing it, constituted admission of lifelong manipulation. If they violated the boundaries now, that recording would reach every member of our extended family. They'd lose not just their relationship with me, but their reputation as devoted parents who'd been wronged by an ungrateful daughter. The truth would replace their narrative permanently. The Lakehouse remained mine. The boundaries held. And I learned that the cruelest thing you can do to people who've spent decades exploiting your guilt is simply stop feeling guilty. They called me selfish for saying no. What they meant was that I'd finally stopped letting them define what love required. That I'd chosen my own peace over their comfort. That I'd recognized property as the least important thing I was actually protecting. What I was really defending was the right to build a life they couldn't move into uninvited, take credit for, or eventually claim as theirs because I'd been too well trained to refuse them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.